And now it's time for the Eliminator RC Tip of the Week.
Hi, I'm Ryan from Eliminator RC. As you've seen from the previous clip, we were at the skate park having some fun with our RCs. But unfortunately, when you go big, sometimes you break. It's a risky take. As you can see here, our Revo has a little bit of chassis walk in the back. We're gonna need a front body post mount, a chassis. We're gonna need one CVD dog bone because it is a little bit bent. And we're gonna need rear bulkhead and a front bulkhead because it is cracked. Let's get started. First, we're gonna take off the wheels. Now you can let the fun begin. Usually with the Revo style chassis, I'll take the front end off, the back end off, and then you can start taking everything off the chassis. When you're taking off a servo linkage from a chassis, what I like to do is I like to take it off the end of the servo arm. If you take it off the servo arm, you're gonna have to realign it later, which is gonna change quite a bit of settings if you have EPAs and dual rates on your remote. To save yourself a little bit of extra time, just take it off the end. It's important that you leave the screws with the piece so you know where they go. Took the skid plate and center skid plate off, the front end falls right off the truck. You can do the same for the back end. For our back end, we only had to take the 2 shock screws out and it detached itself from the chassis. It's a pretty nasty break we had at the skate park, but that's part of the price you pay for having fun with your RCs. Now that our front and back end are off the chassis, we can start dismantling it, and then we can reassemble the chassis and put the front and rear end back on. First step is going to be taking off the electronic speed control, which is made very easy because Traxxas just slides it into slots in the chassis. As you can see, after we took the tranny and motor out as one assembly, along with the receiver and the receiver box and the steering servo, the chassis is almost done. What you'll have to do is pop out the battery trays, the battery vents, and the servo plug for the other hole that's not used. We're down to the skeleton. Now it's time for the hard part, rebuilding. On a quick note though, make sure that when you're putting screws into aluminum or steel that you use blue Loctite. Otherwise what'll happen is when you're driving, the screws will vibrate out and you could not be able to drive your car, or you could break something because the screw has been lost. Now that our chassis is complete, we can start splitting the bulkheads and putting them back together in their new cases. We're going to take the cantilever screw out with the shock and the push rod attached, just to save some assembly time. After that, we'll go ahead and take the CVD off and the bottom skid plate. We took the skid plate off, took the cantilever screws out. Now we can pull the pins for the control arms and go ahead and start splitting the case. And there you have it. The diff case has been split. Be very careful on your reassembly that you are using the front on the front and the rear on the rear. On most trucks, there is a difference. This is the perfect time to check all your differential bearings as well as your wheel bearings. Just give them a little spin. If they are okay, go ahead and wipe them off, re-oil them with your bearing oiler, wipe off the excess oil, and you can go ahead and reinstall them. When you reassemble your gearbox, it's usually crucial that you check for shimming. What you should do is you should try wiggling your differential back and forth. If you look at this one here, it has a little bit of play. For optimum performance of your diff gears and longevity, you should shim it closer to the pinion, and it'll stop you from having to replace your gears prematurely. You're going to need a set of shims specifically designed for differentials. A lot of times you can use a wheel shim from an RC because they are very thin, or something else the same size. This can be achieved by finding out the size of the bearing you have and finding the right size shim that will fit over. The reason why we're using the bearing size is because it's the same size as the diff cup, so you'll be able to slide it over the bearing race. As you can see, the shims are very thin. It doesn't take a lot of them to make a big difference. What I usually do is put one on first, go ahead and slide the case half back on, pinch it together so it's like it has screws in it, and try wiggling it. If you see, we have no more slopping between the two. That's perfect. You can go ahead and start the reassembly. Now that we have our case halves back together and shimmed up, it's very important you have quite a bit of grease in there to let the gears lubricate themselves. If you run them dry, you could get some dust in there and it could cause them to wear uneven. Here is just enough. If you want it to be nice, you could add just a little bit more. Now we can go ahead and put the A-arm assembly back on. As you can see, we have a bent CVD shaft. So we're going to go ahead and replace that while we're in here. It's pretty easy to do. We went ahead and pulled the CVD out, pulled the O-ring back, pushed the pin out, which allowed us to pull the CVD end out. And there you have it, as good as new. We can go ahead and reinstall this. Now that we have the back end 75% assembled, it'll be easier to slide on the chassis like this before we put the cantilevers back on. Don't forget to line up your axle when you're putting it on. Now that the rear differential is bolted back up to the chassis and the center CVT is lined up into the cup, you can go ahead and start bolting back on the rockers and then put the shock support back on. Now that your shocks are all back together, you can go ahead and put the back body post mount and the wing back on. And there you have it. Now the back end is on and 100% complete. We can go ahead and switch to the front end now, and then we'll be ready to rip it once again. We did a quick rebuild on the front, the same as the back, the exact same steps in the exact same order. Now we're going to go ahead and attach this to the chassis. Now that we're done assembling the front bulkhead onto the chassis with the shocks, we can go ahead and put the front bumper assembly on. Now that we're all done putting the front end back on and the front skid plate, we can go ahead and sneak the center skid plate in and reinstall the steering screw in the back of the skid plate. Go ahead and reinstall our wheels and we should be up and driving again. As you can see, we're all complete. Make sure if you're handling a task like this, you have lots of workspace and you have something to put all your screws and your tools into. While you stay there and stay tuned from our RCTV, we're going to go back to the skate park.